The Whisper by the Trough. Part-eye whispers from the past. The late afternoon sun cast long, golden streaks across the dry Oklahoma field as Franklin Wilson leaned on the wooden fence, his boots coated with red dust. Maverick, his young Palomino colt, stood near the water trough but refused to drink. It was the third day in a row. Frank wiped the sweat from his brow and narrowed his eyes, watching the horse carefully. "What's got into you, boy?" he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. The rest of the herd had come and gone, drinking their fill before returning to graze, but Maverick remained still, ears twitching muscles, tense eyes fixed on the ground beneath him. Frank, now in his early 60s, had worked this land all his life. His hands were worn, his shoulders heavy with the weight of years spent in solitude. Since Ellie disappeared 23 years ago, he had grown quieter, more withdrawn, as if the silence of the farm had seeped into his bones. Sometimes, the purest souls are the first to sense the truth, even when it's buried deep beneath the soil. Maverick's strange behavior stirred something inside Frank, an itch he couldn't explain. The colt wasn't sick. His coat was clean, his appetite normal. It was just the water. Or maybe the spot where the water stood. Frank watched as Maverick took a step back from the trough, nostrils flaring, then pawed at the ground with his front hoof. The horse looked up at Frank, eyes wide and intelligent, as if trying to communicate something of grave importance. With a sigh, Frank pushed himself away from the fence and walked toward the barn, boots kicking up dust with each step. The old structure stood resolute against time-weathered boards painted a faded red that had once been bright as a cardinal's wing. Inside, the air was cool and filled with the familiar smells of hay leather and decades of honest work. Frank grabbed an old shovel from its place on the wall, testing its weight in his hands before heading back to the trough. Maverick stepped aside as Frank approached, watching with those wide, steady eyes. Frank jabbed the shovel into the dirt beside the wooden base of the trough. The ground was harder than usual, dense, almost packed unnaturally tight. Each thrust of the blade brought a deeper unease, like digging into something that didn't want to be found. "What are you expecting to find, old man?" he muttered to himself, the shovel biting deeper into the earth. 3 feet down, the metal edge struck something soft but solid. Not a rock, not a root. Frank knelt down the knees of his worn jeans, pressing into the dirt, and brushed away the soil with his thick fingers, until he uncovered what felt like fabric, coarse and old. A burlap sack. He stared at it, heart beginning to race as a foul smell began to rise from the disturbed soil. A mix of rot oil and something metallic that caught in the back of his throat. Maverick let out a sharp snort and backed away quickly, his golden coat gleaming in the late afternoon sun. Frank stood up slowly, the shovel still in hand, his pulse pounding in his ears. The Oklahoma wind swept through the trees and carried that awful scent up to his nose. He coughed, then looked around as if expecting someone to be watching. But the fields were empty, quiet, heavy with a kind of silence that meant trouble. Whatever was buried here had been hidden for a long time. And now it was Maverick, his most sensitive, most loyal animal, who had unearthed the first clue to a secret Frank had buried deep both in the ground and in himself. Underscore 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 underscore. Frank didn't sleep that night. He sat by the kitchen window, the same spot where Ellie used to drink her coffee every morning. The burlap sack he unearthed still haunted him. He hadn't opened it. Not yet. It remained covered in the barn under an old tarp, and yet the smell clung to his skin like a warning. The house felt emptier than usual tonight, Frank's gaze drifted to the refrigerator, where a faded magnet still held a family photo from decades ago. Frank younger, and standing taller Ellie, with her gentle smile and knowing eyes, and little Grace between them, gap-toothed and beaming. They looked happy. They had been happy, until Ellie vanished without a trace 23 years ago. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence, marking time in a house where it seemed to have stopped long ago. Frank had kept everything exactly as it was the day she disappeared. Her coffee mug still in the cupboard, her gardening gloves still hanging by the back door, her brush still on the dresser, with a few strands of hair caught in the bristles. As if preserving these things might somehow preserve the hope of her return. The phone never rang anymore. No letters came from Grace. Their last bitter conversation had ended with her accusation. "You know what happened to Mom. You've always known." Frank rubbed his eyes, feeling the weight of decades of suspicion. How many nights had the townspeople whispered about him? The man whose wife mysteriously vanished. The man who didn't search hard enough. The man who might have done something terrible. "Since Ellie disappeared, I've lived in silence," Frank whispered to the empty room. But sometimes, silence has a voice of its own. Outside, the moon cast silver light across the fields, and Frank could see Maverick standing motionless by the fence, as if keeping watch. The horse hadn't gone near the barn since Frank had brought the sack inside, standing at a distance with his head low, like he knew that something dark had been pulled back into the daylight. By morning, Frank knew what he had to do. The burlap sack wouldn't open itself, and the truth, whatever it might be, had waited long enough. Underscore, 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 underscore. The barn door creaked open as Frank stepped inside, dawn light filtering through the dusty windows. The air was thick and still holding the scent of hay and iron, but underneath it all, that other smell lingered. Stronger now. He walked to where he'd hidden the sack beneath the heavy tarp. Maverick's shadow appeared in the doorway, but the horse wouldn't enter, watching cautiously from outside. Frank pulled the tarp back slowly, hesitating for the first time in years. It wasn't fear of what he'd find. It was fear of what he might already know. His hands shook as he untied the twine around the sack. The fabric crumbled slightly at the edges, brittle with age. Inside, wrapped in layers of plastic and oil-stained cloth, was a metal box, about the size of a bread loaf, sealed tight, rusted around the edges. Frank sat back on his heels, breathing hard. He recognized the box. It had belonged to Ellie. She used to keep photographs in it. Letters, little things she didn't want anyone to see. But Frank hadn't seen it since before she vanished. He didn't open it. Not yet. His throat tightened as he looked at the dent in the side, the scratches along the lid. Part of him wanted to toss it back in the hole and bury it deeper, but Maverick still stood just outside the barn door, watching. Silent, like he was waiting. Frank wiped his hands on his jeans and walked back toward the kitchen, clutching the box tight against his chest, as if it might fall apart if he loosened his grip. The morning light flooded the kitchen, now illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Frank placed the box on the table and stared at it. 23 years of questions of suspicion, of whispers behind his back, and here sat a potential answer that he wasn't sure he wanted. "What will I find in there, Ellie?" he asked aloud. "Will it tell me where you went, or will it tell me something I don't want to know?" Frank took a deep breath and finally opened the box. Inside were a handful of yellowed photographs, a few folded letters, and at the bottom, a silver necklace with a cracked turquoise stone. He hadn't seen that necklace in over 2 decades. It was the one Ellie had worn the day she disappeared. His breath caught. She wouldn't have left it behind. The necklace had been his gift to her on their wedding day, and she had promised never to take it off. She would never leave without this, he whispered, his voice breaking. Never. With trembling fingers, Frank unfolded the first letter. It was addressed to him, but never sent. The handwriting was hers, delicate, slanted, unmistakable. The words were short, careful, full of pauses and unfinished thoughts. But there was one line that stood out underlined twice in faint pencil. If anything happens to me, don't trust Walter. Frank stared at the words, his chest hollowing out with cold realization. Walter Hayes, his neighbor for 40 years. The man he'd shared sweet tea with just yesterday. The man who had known exactly where the sack had been buried before Frank had told him anything. Was Walter not just holding on to old stories, but holding on to the truth all along? Underscore, 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 Frank drove down the dusty road toward Walter Hayes's property. Dust billowing behind his truck like a storm cloud. His mind raced with questions, with doubts, with a growing sense of betrayal that burned in his chest. He found Walter sitting on the porch of his faded white house, shelling peas into a dented metal bowl. The old man looked up as Frank pulled in and nodded once. The kind of nod men gave each other when they knew words were optional. Walter was older than Frank by about a decade, his face more deeply lined, his hands more gnarled. They had been neighbors since Frank bought his land as a young man fresh from Vietnam. They had fished together, helped each other through droughts and storms, shared meals and memories. Or so Frank had thought. "You're back," Walter said, simply not looking up from his peas. Frank stood at the bottom of the porch steps, feeling the weight of the letter in his pocket. "I found something," he said, his voice tight. Walter didn't ask what. He just motioned to the empty chair beside him and handed Frank a cold glass of sweet tea condensation running down the side like tears. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the wind and the quiet clink of peas in the bowl. Then Walter said, "Back near the trough, wasn't it?" Frank froze. His heart stuttered. He hadn't told him that. Walter looked at him with tired eyes. "That ground's got memory, Frank. Stuff don't just stay buried." Frank felt a chill crawl down his spine. The past, it seemed, wasn't as far away as he'd convinced himself. Whatever had been hidden beneath that soil, it wasn't just physical. It was history. Family secrets. And Walter knew more than he let on. But before Frank could ask, Walter added quietly, "Some things you dig up, they don't stay still after." Frank set down the untouched tea. "What do you know about my wife, Walter? What do you know about Ellie?" Walter's hand stilled a pea half-shelled between his fingers. His eyes faded blue and watery with age, looked past Frank to the horizon. "I know she was afraid, before she vanished." "Of what?" Frank demanded, his voice rising. "Of who?" "Maybe of you," Walter said softly. The words hit Frank like a physical blow. He stepped back, shaking his head. "That's not true. Ellie wasn't afraid of me. We had our arguments, sure, but she knew I'd never hurt her." "Did she?" Walter asked, his voice carrying no accusation, just a quiet sadness. Frank pulled Ellie's letter from his pocket and held it up. "She wrote this. Said not to trust you." Now why would she say that, Walter, if I was the one she was afraid of? Walter looked at the letter, but made no move to take it. "Because I knew things, Frank. Things I didn't tell. Maybe I should have. Frank felt his anger rising. 23 years of guilt, of wondering, of being the subject of suspicion, and Walter had been sitting on information the whole time. What things? Frank demanded. Tell me now, Walter, or I swear to God. You really don't remember, do you? Walter interrupted, his eyes suddenly sharp. That night before she disappeared. You were different. Changed. Like you weren't even you. Frank's anger faltered, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. What are you talking about? Ellie came to me that night. Walter said, his voice low. She was terrified. Said you'd found something out behind the barn. Something you weren't supposed to. Frank's stomach dropped. I don't remember anything like that. Walter looked up slowly, eyes wet and haunted. That's just it, Frank. You don't remember because someone didn't want you to. Underscore, 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 underscore. Frank stood frozen on Walter's porch, the old man's words echoing through the air, like thunder that never faded. You don't remember because someone didn't want you to. Was it a lie? Some manipulative trick? Or was it worse? The truth he'd been too blind or too broken to face. He sat down slowly in the offered chair, eyes locked on Walter, heart pounding like hooves on dry earth. I never drank. Frank muttered more to himself than to Walter. Not like that. I was clear-headed. I never lost time. You lost a whole night, Frank, Walter said. You just didn't realize it. The old man set down his bowl of peas and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. Ellie came to me after y'all fought. She said you were different, like you weren't even you anymore. Said she found something on your clothes. Something oily chemical. He paused, the weight of memory visible in the slump of his shoulders. She was scared of you that night. Frank clenched his jaw. His fingers gripped the edge of the chair as his mind tried to push against the wall of memory. But there was nothing behind it. A black void where a night should have been. He remembered arguing with Ellie, yes, but he always told himself it was just a rough patch. Nothing unusual. He remembered her walking away from the kitchen table, tears in her eyes, and then he was waking up the next morning alone, with only silence, where her voice used to be. If you knew all this, Frank said, his voice dangerous and low, why didn't you say something? Why let me think she ran off? Walter looked down ashamed, because I didn't know who to trust either. She told me she was going to the sheriff, but then she vanished and I panicked. I didn't know if she made it. He stopped, the words too heavy to say aloud. You thought I did something to her, Frank finished for him. You thought I hurt my own wife. Walter didn't deny it. I didn't know what you were capable of, not that night. Frank stood the chair, scraping loudly against the wood floor. His face was pale eyes, wide hands shaking. For the first time in decades, he felt like a stranger in his own life. If Ellie had feared him, if Walter had doubted him, what else had he missed? And then a terrible thought landed in his chest like a weight. What if someone had made sure he wouldn't remember on purpose? This chemical, Frank said, fighting to keep his voice steady. What was it? What did she find on my clothes? Walter shook his head. She didn't know exactly. Just said it smelled strange, like pesticide, but stronger. Said your eyes were glassy after you came in from the barn. Pesticide. The word rang in Frank's ears like a warning bell. Their farm had never used heavy chemicals. Ellie had been adamant about that. But someone else might have brought them onto the property. I need to go, Frank said suddenly. I need to check something. Walter nodded, the gesture heavy with unspoken understanding. Be careful, Frank. Whatever you're digging into, it's been waiting a long time to be found. Underscore 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 underscore. Frank barely slept. He sat by the window until dawn, watching the wind twist through the trees like whispers he couldn't hear. The thought that someone may have tampered with his mind gnawed at him like a hungry thing. He remembered feeling sick that night back when Ellie disappeared, lightheaded dizzy like a flu that came and went in hours. But now he wondered, was it something else entirely? Something done to him? By mid-morning, he drove into town and parked outside the small veterinary clinic where Dr. Linda Morgan worked. Not for Maverick, but for answers. The clinic was a modest building with a weathered sign swinging gently in the breeze. Inside the waiting room was empty except for an elderly woman with a cat carrier. The receptionist, a young woman with kind eyes, looked up as Frank entered. "Mr. Wilson," she said with a smile. "We weren't expecting you today. Is Maverick all right?" "He's fine," Frank said. "I need to speak with Dr. Morgan. It's important." A few minutes later, Frank was seated in Linda's office. She was a woman in her early 50s with intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense manner that Frank had always appreciated. She'd moved to town 15 years ago and had quickly become respected for her knowledge not just of animals, but of environmental issues affecting local farms. "What can I do for you, Frank?" she asked, leaning back in her chair. "You look like you haven't slept." Frank had brought a small jar containing soil from near the trough. He placed it on her desk and told her everything. The sack, the box, the letters, even the missing memories. Linda listened in silence, her face tight-focused, occasionally jotting notes. When he finished, she picked up the jar and examined the soil. "I can test this," she said, "but from what you're describing, I might already know what we're dealing with." She set the jar down and leaned forward. "There's a pesticide called PX450, restricted, not legal for years now. Used to be common in the 80s, before they discovered its side effects." She paused, choosing her words carefully. In high doses, it caused blackouts, memory loss, disorientation. It was banned after several agricultural workers experienced what they called lost time after exposure. Frank's blood turned cold. Could someone have used it deliberately to make me forget? Linda nodded slowly. It was sometimes mixed with water or sprayed in enclosed spaces. The victim would breathe it in or absorb it through the skin. Within an hour, they'd be suggestible confused. By morning, they'd have no memory of several hours. She hesitated. "And if Ellie found traces of it on your clothes, Frank, it means someone deliberately exposed you." The idea that someone had drugged him not to kill, but to erase, was worse than anything he'd imagined. "Who would do that?" he asked. "Why?" Linda's eyes were somber. "Someone with access to restricted chemicals. Someone who didn't want you to remember something you saw, and someone who might have had reason to want Ellie silenced when she figured it out." Frank's first instinct was to think of Walter, but Walter had been afraid too, and if he was telling the truth, then there was something or someone else involved. Someone with access to chemicals knowledge of the land, and a reason to silence Ellie. "I need to check the barn again," Frank said, standing up. "There might be more evidence there." Linda nodded. "I'll analyze this soil sample properly, see if I can confirm PX450. But Frank," she added, her voice gentle but firm, "be careful. If someone went to these lengths 23 years ago, there's no telling what they might do if they think you're getting close to the truth. Underscore, 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 underscore. The barn looked different now, threatening somehow. Frank scanned everything with new suspicion. The tools, the feed bags, the old storage containers stacked in the corner like forgotten sins. Maverick watched from outside, still refusing to enter. Frank moved methodically, checking every corner, every hiding place, behind each tool, under every shelf, looking for something he might have missed all these years. And then he saw it. Behind a wooden board that had partially pulled away from the wall, tucked into a crack and nearly invisible, was a rusted metal canister labeled PX 450. The label was faded, almost illegible, but it was there, and it wasn't his. Frank carefully pulled the canister free, heart pounding. He wasn't just digging into the past anymore. He was uncovering a crime, one that had lived under his roof all along. With the canister secured in a plastic bag, Frank returned to the house. The metal box still sat on the kitchen table, its contents spread out. The photographs, the letters, the turquoise necklace. He picked up the second letter, which he hadn't read yet. It was dated 2 weeks before Ellie disappeared. This one was longer, more emotional. She spoke of feeling watched, of finding things moved in the house, of waking up in the middle of the night to strange noises outside the bedroom window. "You don't believe me," she had written, "but something is wrong. Someone's been near the barn." Frank ran his fingers along the old paper, and for the first time in years felt real fear. Not the kind that came with being alone or losing someone, but the kind that came from knowing you missed something important, something right in front of you. He had dismissed her fears back then, told her she was tired, stressed imagining things. But what if she had been right all along? Outside, Maverick paced near the fence, uneasy again. Frank stepped out and looked toward Walter's land across the field. The trees that lined the boundary swayed gently in the wind, calm and indifferent. But now Frank saw that land differently, saw it as Ellie had, with suspicion. He hadn't spoken to Walter since the visit yesterday. He had thanked him, shaken his hand, and walked away without realizing the man might have been lying through his teeth. Frank walked back to the barn. Something else inside him had shifted, something slow and heavy. He began rummaging through old boxes in the loft, looking for anything Ellie might have hidden, anything he had overlooked. Behind a stack of moldy blankets, he found an old shoebox wrapped in newspaper. Inside a roll of undeveloped film, a pack of matches, and a folded map of the property marked with a red X just behind the water trough. His heart pounded. Ellie had left more than letters. She had left a trail, and Frank was only now starting to see where it led. Underscore, 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 underscore. Frank stood alone in the fading light, staring at the old map Ellie had marked with a red X. The soil beneath the water trough had already given up one secret, the metal box. But now this mark was a few yards beyond it, at the edge of a patch of dead grass, where nothing had grown in years. He grabbed his shovel again, the same one that had changed everything days ago, and made his way toward the spot without a word. The first few inches were dry, brittle, easy to break through. But as he dug deeper, the earth grew darker, damp, heavier. The shovel struck something solid again. This time not fabric, not wood. It was metallic. Frank fell to his knees and used his hands to brush away the dirt. A rusted lockbox, larger than the one before, rested beneath the surface like a time capsule buried in guilt. It had no name, no markings, but he knew this was hers. Ellie had put it there. He pried it open with a crowbar from the barn. Inside were photographs, black and white, grainy, taken with a small camera. Some were of the barn, others were of a truck, parked in places it shouldn't have been. Not Walter's truck, but one Frank didn't immediately recognize. But one photo made his stomach tighten. A blurry shot of Ellie standing near the trough, looking over her shoulder with a terrified expression. Behind her, barely visible, was a silhouette in the tree line, watching. Frank stumbled back, holding the photo in trembling hands. The past had always been a weight, but now it had a face. The fear in Ellie's eyes wasn't imagined. It was real, and someone had been following her. He flipped the photo over. On the back, in Ellie's handwriting, Reynolds watching again, going to sheriff tomorrow. Reynolds. The name hit Frank like a punch to the gut. Daniel Reynolds, the county soil inspector from back then. He'd visited the farm several times in the months before Ellie disappeared, collecting samples, writing reports. Frank had thought nothing of it at the time. Reynolds had disappeared shortly after Ellie did. Left town in the middle of the night. No warning, no trace. Everyone assumed it was unrelated. The guilt that had kept Frank quiet for 2 decades suddenly shifted into something else. Rage. That night, he sat by the fire, turning the photo over and over in his hands. He thought of all the nights Ellie had cried, all the time she tried to speak. He had ignored her chosen silence over discomfort. And now the cost of that silence was unraveling before him. His fists clenched. He had to find Daniel Reynolds. Not tomorrow, not later. Tonight. But as he reached for his coat, a soft knock came at the door. The knock was soft, hesitant, like whoever stood outside wasn't sure they should be there at all. Frank froze. The fire behind him crackled, casting shadows across the room, but the photo still lay on the table, staring back at him. He slowly stood, walked to the door, and opened it without a word. Standing on the porch beneath a wide-brimmed hat, and with an unreadable expression, was Walter Hayes. "I figured we ought to talk," Walter said. Voice low, eyes avoiding Frank's. "You've been digging." Frank didn't move. His jaw tightened, heart thudding in his chest. Every instinct told him to slam the door, or worse, but he stepped aside instead. "Then you already know what I found," he said quietly. Walter entered without answering, his boots heavy on the wood floor, like he carried years of secrets with every step. He glanced at the table and the photo lying there exposed. Walter's face barely changed, but Frank saw it. A flicker of recognition, a crack in the mask. "She took those photos the week before she vanished," Frank said. "She was scared. She said someone was watching her. She marked the spot on a map." He stepped closer to Walter, voice hardening. That box was buried where she said it would be. Walter looked down, hands clasped in front of him like he was at a funeral. "You think I did something to her?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Frank, we were friends." Frank slammed his hand on the table, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "Were we? Because she left me a letter saying not to trust you, and you knew where that sack was buried before I told you anything." His voice rose with each word. "So you'd better start talking, or I swear to God I'll let the sheriff sort it out." Silence filled the room. The fire snapped again. Walter stared at the flames, lips trembling as if something unspeakable sat behind them. Then he finally said, "She came to me that night, the night she disappeared." He looked up at Frank, eyes filled with a mixture of fear and regret. "She was terrified. Told me you'd found something out behind the barn, something you weren't supposed to." Frank's stomach dropped. His voice was weak when he asked, "What are you talking about? I don't remember anything like that." Walter looked up slowly, eyes wet and haunted. "That's just it, Frank. You don't remember because someone didn't want you to." Frank stood frozen, the room suddenly smaller around him. Walter's words echoed through the air like thunder that never faded. You don't remember because someone didn't want you to. As the fire crackled in the hearth, Frank looked down at the photo one last time. It wasn't just evidence. It was the last piece of Ellie's voice begging him to finally listen. And this time he would. I'll write part 2 following the outline and requirements. Here's the continuation of our story. The Whisper by the Trough, in part 2, Buried Truth. Frank stared at the first letter again as sunlight poured through the kitchen window. The line, "Don't trust Walter," echoed in his mind like a hammer hitting steel. It shook something loose inside him. For over 20 years, he had blamed himself. He had believed Ellie left because of something broken between them. But what if that wasn't the truth? What if she'd been trying to warn him, and he hadn't seen it? He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the table, the metal box still open beside him. The turquoise necklace caught the morning light, the crack in the stone like a scar across its face. Frank touched it gently, remembering how it had looked against Ellie's skin, how she'd promised never to take it off. Why would she leave this behind? He whispered to the empty kitchen. She wouldn't. He picked up the second letter. It was dated 2 weeks before Ellie disappeared. This one was longer, more emotional, the handwriting less controlled, as if written in haste or fear. "Frank," it began, "I don't know who to trust anymore. I feel like I'm being watched. Yesterday, I found the kitchen drawers rearranged. The day before, my gardening tools were moved. I know you think I'm being paranoid, but something is wrong." Frank's throat tightened as he read. How had he missed the fear in her words? "Last night I heard footsteps outside our bedroom window. I woke you, but by the time you checked, they were gone. You said it was probably just a raccoon, but raccoons don't wear boots, Frank. I saw the prints in the mud this morning." He closed his eyes, the memory surfacing faintly. Ellie shaking him awake in the darkness, her voice tight with fear. Him grumbling and half asleep, seeing nothing and crawling back to bed, telling her it was just her imagination. "Someone's been near the barn," the letter continued. "The lock was tampered with. I found muddy footprints that weren't yours. I think it has something to do with Reynolds. He's been taking soil samples from places he shouldn't, asking questions about our water supply. I've seen his truck parked on the back road at odd hours." Frank ran his fingers along the old paper, feeling the indentations where Ellie had pressed the pen hard against the page. "You don't believe me. I can see it in your eyes. You think I'm stressed imagining things. But I know what I've seen. I'm going to collect evidence, and then I'll go to the sheriff. If anything happens to me before, then look behind the water trough. I've hidden something there that might explain everything." The letter ended abruptly, as if she'd been interrupted while writing. Frank set it down, hands shaking slightly. Outside, Maverick paced near the fence, uneasy again. Frank stood and looked out toward Walter's property across the field. The trees that lined the boundary swayed gently in the wind, calm and indifferent. But now he saw that land differently. He saw it as Ellie had, with suspicion and fear. He hadn't spoken to Walter since their confrontation the previous evening. The old man had told him things that seemed impossible, that Frank had lost an entire night, that Ellie had been afraid of him, that someone had deliberately made him forget. Frank walked back to the barn, a new determination in his step. Something inside him had shifted, something slow and heavy, like a door long rusted shut, finally swinging open. He began methodically searching the loft, looking for anything else Ellie might have hidden, anything he had overlooked all these years. Behind a stack of moldy blankets tucked into a forgotten corner, he found an old shoebox wrapped in faded newspaper, dated just before Ellie's disappearance. His heart pounded as he carefully opened it. Inside was a roll of undeveloped film, a book of matches, and a folded map of the property. Red ink circled the water trough with an X marked just a few yards beyond it, at the edge of a patch where nothing had grown in over 2 decades. "Oh, Ellie," he whispered, tracing the X with his finger. "You were leaving me breadcrumbs all along." Underscore 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 underscore. The afternoon sun beat down on Frank's shoulders as he dug at the spot marked on Ellie's map. Sweat dripped from his brow, stinging his eyes, but he didn't stop. Maverick watched from a distance, head-high nostrils flaring occasionally at the disturbed earth. The first few inches were dry, brittle, easy to break through. But as Frank dug deeper, the soil grew darker, damp heavier. The shovel struck something solid with a dull metallic thud. This time not fabric, not a small box. Frank fell to his knees and used his hands to brush away the dirt, uncovering a rusted lockbox about the size of a small suitcase. It had no name, no markings, but he knew with certainty this was Ellie's. She had put it here knowing someday he might find it. He pried it open with a crowbar from the barn, the lock giving way with a groan of protest. Inside, protected by layers of plastic, were dozens of photographs, black and white grainy, taken with what must have been a small camera. Frank spread them out on the ground beside the hole. Some were of the barn, taken from different angles, showing footprints in the mud that weren't his own. Others captured a truck parked along the back road that bordered their property. Not Walter's truck, but one Frank recognized as belonging to Daniel Reynolds, the county soil inspector. But one photo made his stomach tighten into a knot. A blurry shot of Ellie herself, standing near the trough, looking over her shoulder with an expression of pure terror. Behind her, barely visible in the tree line, was a silhouette of a man watching. Frank turned the photo over with trembling hands. On a back in Ellie's handwriting, "Reynolds watching again, going to sheriff tomorrow." Tomorrow. The day she disappeared. Frank stumbled back, sitting heavily on the ground. The past had always been a weight, but now it had a face. The fear in Ellie's eyes wasn't imagined. It was real. And Daniel Reynolds had been watching her, following her, perhaps planning what would happen next. Reynolds, the county soil inspector who had visited their farm several times in the months before Ellie's disappearance. The man who had collected samples, written reports, asked questions about their water. The man who had vanished from town shortly after Ellie did supposedly for a better job opportunity in another state. Everyone had assumed the timing was coincidental. But now, looking at these photos, Frank knew better. The guilt that had kept him silent for 2 decades suddenly shifted into something else. Rage, pure and clarifying, rose in his chest like fire. "I'll find you," he whispered to Reynolds' shadowy figure in the photograph. "Wherever you are, I'll find you." Underscore 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 underscore. Dr. Linda Morgan called. Just as Frank was loading the lockbox into his truck. "I analyzed that soil sample," she said without preamble. "You were right to be concerned. There are definite traces of PX 450. Frank's grip tightened on the phone. "You're sure?" "Positive. It's degraded after all this time, but the chemical signature is unmistakable. Someone used professional-grade pesticide near your water trough." She paused. "Frank, this stuff was tightly regulated even back then. Only licensed agricultural inspectors or large commercial operations would have had access, like Daniel Reynolds," Frank thought. "A county soil inspector would have had the authority, the access." "There's something else," Linda continued. "PX 450 doesn't just cause memory loss. In high doses, it can trigger hallucinations, paranoia, even violent outbursts. If someone exposed you to it, She didn't finish the thought. They could have made me do anything, Frank said quietly, the implications washing over him like ice water. Or made me think I did something I didn't. Exactly. This wasn't just about making you forget, Frank. It could have been about creating false memories, or at least confusion. Her voice softened. Have you considered going to the sheriff with this? Frank looked at the box of photographs. Not yet. I need more proof. Something concrete connecting Reynolds to what happened. Reynolds, Daniel Reynolds, the old soil inspector. Linda sounded surprised. What does he have to do with this? Everything, I think. Frank described the photographs, the notes, Ellie's suspicions. She was going to report him for something the day she disappeared. I think he found out and... He couldn't finish the sentence. Linda was silent for a moment. Be careful, Frank. If Reynolds did something to Ellie and he finds out you're investigating, you could be in danger. I know, Frank said, but I've waited 23 years for answers. I'm not stopping now. After hanging up, Frank drove back to his house, the lockbox secure in the truck bed. He needed to think to plan his next move. Reynolds had left town decades ago, but someone might know where he went. The county office would have records forwarding addresses something. As he turned onto his driveway, he noticed a car he didn't recognize parked near the house, a sleek black sedan with government plates. Standing on his porch examining the door was a woman in a tailored suit. Frank parked and approached cautiously. Can I help you? The woman turned. She was in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a professional bun, and familiar eyes that hit Frank like a physical blow. Hello, Dad, said Grace Wilson. Underscore 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 Frank stood frozen, unable to speak. His daughter, whom he hadn't seen in 4 years, stood before him like an apparition. She looked more like Ellie than ever. The same determined set to her jaw, the same intelligent eyes. Grace, he finally managed. What are you doing here? She crossed her arms, professional and distant. Sheriff Cooper called me. Said you were stirring up old questions about Mom. So, her gaze flicked to the truck where the edge of the lockbox was visible. Said you might be in over your head. Frank hadn't spoken to Grace since their last bitter phone call 4 years ago, when she'd accused him of not doing enough to find her mother, of moving on too easily, of perhaps knowing more than he admitted. She'd built her own life in Chicago, becoming an environmental lawyer, keeping contact to holiday cards and occasional terse emails. You'd better come inside, Frank said, unlocking the door. The house was exactly as Grace remembered it. Nothing had changed since she'd left for college 12 years ago. The same faded curtains, the same worn furniture, even the same magnets on the refrigerator. You still haven't redecorated? She observed, setting her purse on the counter. Never saw the need, Frank replied. He hesitated, then added, Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot. Grace nodded, some of the professional coldness melting away. Black. Still black. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where their family had once shared meals, where Frank and Ellie had their last argument, where Grace had announced she was leaving Oklahoma for good. Sheriff Cooper was vague. Grace said, curling her hands around the mug. Said you found something on the property. Something about Mom. Frank studied his daughter's face, seeing the mixture of hope and fear she was trying to hide behind her composed exterior. He'd kept the truth from her for years. His suspicions, his guilt, his doubts. Maybe it was time for honesty. Maverick, my horse, he refused to drink from the water trough. 3 days in a row. Frank began telling the story from the beginning, the burlap sack, the metal box, Ellie's letters, the photographs, Walter's confessions, the PX, 450. As he spoke, Grace's professional demeanor cracked emotion flooding her face. When he showed her the turquoise necklace, she took it with trembling hands. "She never took this off," Grace whispered. "Never. Not even to shower." "I know," Frank said softly. "That's when I knew she didn't just leave us." Grace looked up, tears brimming in her eyes. "All this time I thought—" She swallowed hard. "I thought maybe you'd done something to her, that you'd had a fight and lost control, or that you knew why she left and wouldn't tell me." The accusation hung between them, the same one she'd hurled at him 4 years ago. "You know what happened to Mom. You've always known." Frank reached across the table hesitantly, taking his daughter's hand. "I think someone wanted us to believe that, wanted me to doubt myself. But your mother was trying to tell me something, and I was too blind to see it." Grace wiped her eyes, composure returning. "This Reynolds person, the soil inspector, do you think he killed her?" Frank nodded grimly. "I think she discovered something he was doing. Something illegal involving chemicals, water contamination. She was gathering evidence, planning to go to the sheriff. And he found out," Grace concluded, "drugged you with this PX 450 stuff to confuse you then." She couldn't finish. "Then he silenced her," Frank said. The words felt like stones in his mouth. "And I spent 23 years thinking she'd abandoned us." Grace pulled her hand back, professional instincts taking over. "We need to find Reynolds. If he's still alive, he needs to answer for this." She stood up, pacing the small kitchen. "I can help. Environmental cases, chemical companies, whistleblowers. This is what I do, Dad." Frank watched his daughter transform before his eyes, grief channeling into determination. She was Ellie's daughter, through and through. "Where do we start?" he asked. Underscore 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 underscore. Frank spent the rest of the afternoon showing Grace everything. He'd found the original metal box, the letters, the map, the lockbox, with photographs, the rusted PX 450 canister from behind the barn wall. "This is more than suspicion," Grace said, examining the evidence with a lawyer's eye. "This is a pattern, a timeline. But it's all circumstantial. We need something concrete that puts Reynolds at the scene, something that directly connects him to Mom's disappearance." Frank nodded. Walter might know more than he's saying. He admitted Ellie came to him that night, that she was afraid. "Walter Hayes." Grace frowned. "Mom's letter said not to trust him." "I know, but he's our only link to that night, and he's finally talking." They drove to Walter's place as the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon. The old man was in his garden, pulling weeds with gnarled hands. He straightened slowly when he saw Frank's truck, and his eyes widened at the sight of Grace. "Well, I'll be," Walter said softly as they approached. "Little Gracie Wilson, all grown up." Grace's expression remained cool. "Mr. Hayes, I understand you have information about my mother's disappearance." Walter looked from Grace to Frank, then gestured toward the house. "Best come inside. Some conversations shouldn't happen in the open air." Walter's living room was sparse, but neat with furniture that had seen decades of use, but was well maintained. He offered them sweet tea, which Grace declined, and Frank accepted out of habit. "Your mother came to me the night she disappeared." Walter began, settling into his armchair. "She was frightened, more scared than I'd ever seen her. Said she'd caught Frank in the barn, acting strange like he wasn't himself." "What was my father doing?" Grace asked. Walter shook his head. "She didn't say exactly, just that he seemed drugged, confused." When she tried to talk to him, he didn't recognize her at first, then got angry in a way that wasn't like him. He looked at Frank. "She found something on your clothes when you came in. An oily residue that smelled chemical. She showed me a sample she'd collected." "The PX 450, Frank murmured. Walter nodded. "She thought someone had exposed you to something. Said it had to do with Reynolds with soil tests he'd been running. She'd been tracking him, taking photos, collecting evidence." "Evidence of what?" Grace pressed. Walter looked down at his hands. "Blackwood Chemicals had a facility about 30 miles from here. They produced agricultural compounds, including PX 450, before it was restricted. Reynolds was supposed to be monitoring local farms for contamination, but Ellie thought he was doing the opposite, helping Blackwood dump waste into the groundwater, falsifying reports to cover it up." Grace leaned forward, her lawyer's instincts on high alert. "And Mom found proof. She said she had documents, photographs. Said Reynolds had been on your property not to take samples, but to plant chemicals to create false positives that would justify more aggressive pesticide use." Walter looked at Frank. "She thought you might have caught him in the act that night in the barn." Frank closed his eyes, trying to force his memory back to that night. There was still nothing but darkness where those hours should have been. "If I caught him," Frank said slowly, "he would have needed to silence me. The PX 450 would make me forget, make me confused." "But why not just kill Dad, too?" Grace asked bluntly. "Why leave a living witness?" Walter shook his head. A double disappearance would have raised too many alarms. But a wife leaving her husband, that happens every day. And with Frank, confused, possibly violent from the drug effects, the story would write itself. "Everyone would think I'd done something to her," Frank realized. "Or that she'd run from me." "Which is exactly what happened," Grace said softly. "The whole town whispered about you for years." Walter looked ashamed. "I should have said something. Should have gone to the sheriff with what Ellie told me. But after she vanished, I got scared. Reynolds came to see me the next day. Said I should keep my mouth shut if I knew what was good for me." "He threatened you?" Frank asked. Walter nodded. "Not directly. Just mentioned how unfortunate it would be if inspectors found illegal chemicals on my farm, too. How easily I could lose everything." I understood what he meant. He looked at Grace. "I was a coward. I'm sorry." Grace's expression softened slightly. "Did Mom say where she was going after she left your house that night?" "She was heading to town to the sheriff's office. Said she had everything she needed in her bag." Walter hesitated. "But she never made it there. I waited for news the next day, but there was nothing." Then Frank reported her missing, and when I saw the state he was in, confused, no memory of the night before, I knew something had gone wrong. Frank stood abruptly, pacing the small room. "We need to find Reynolds. He's the key to all of this." "He left town about a month after Ellie disappeared," Walter said. "Supposedly took a job with a chemical company out of state. I heard he did well for himself. Ended up as an executive at Blackwood Chemicals." Grace pulled out her phone. "Blackwood Chemicals is still in business, headquartered in Oklahoma City now." She looked up at Frank, determination in her eyes. "I can find him, Dad. This is what I do. Underscore, 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 underscore. Back at the house, Grace set up her laptop at the kitchen table, transforming the space into a makeshift command center. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she accessed databases, public records, and professional networks. "Daniel Reynolds," she murmured, scanning the screen. 69 years old now. Former county soil inspector joined Blackwood Chemicals in 1998 as an environmental compliance manager. She looked up at Frank, a year after Mom disappeared. Quite a promotion for a county inspector, Frank observed. It gets better. He rose through the ranks quickly. Operations director by 2005, vice president by 2010, and CEO since 2015. Grace turned the laptop so Frank could see Reynolds' corporate headshot, an older man with silver hair and cold eyes, smiling confidently in an expensive suit. "He's still in Oklahoma," Frank said, surprise in his voice. "Oklahoma City, about 3 hours from here." Grace continued scrolling through information. Blackwood Chemicals has had multiple EPA violations over the years, all settled with fines, no criminal charges. They've been sued by environmental groups at least 6 times for groundwater contamination. "Like what Ellie suspected they were doing here," Frank said. Grace nodded. "There's a pattern. They move into rural areas, set up operations, contaminate the water, then offer to fix the problem with their own chemical treatments, creating a cycle of dependence on their products." She clicked through more pages. Reynolds is well connected politically, donates to campaigns, sits on state boards. He's protected. Frank stared at Reynolds' face on the screen. "Not anymore. Not if we can prove what he did to Ellie." Grace looked up at her father, seeing the determination in his weathered face. "Dad, we need to be careful. This man is powerful, dangerous. If he killed Mom and has gotten away with it for 23 years, he won't hesitate to protect himself." "I know," Frank said, "but I've waited long enough for the truth." He walked to the window, looking out at the darkening fields. Maverick stood near the fence, head raised, watching the house as if standing guard. "We should get the sheriff involved," Grace suggested. "Official channels, legal protections." Frank turned back to her. "Sheriff Cooper is a good man, but he's one county lawman against a corporate executive with political connections. We need more than suspicion before we involve him." Grace considered this, then nodded. "You're right. We need hard evidence." She turned back to her laptop. "Reynolds is speaking at a chemical industry conference in Oklahoma City tomorrow. Public appearance security, but not excessive. We could approach him, see how he reacts when confronted about Mom." "He'd never admit anything in public," Frank said. "No, but his reaction might tell us something, and it gives us a chance to follow him, see where he goes, who he meets." Grace smiled grimly. "I didn't become an environmental lawyer without learning how to investigate corporate criminals, Dad." Frank studied his daughter, seeing again how much she resembled Ellie. Not just in appearance, but in her fierce determination, her intelligence, her unwillingness to back down from what she believed was right. "What's our first move?" he asked. "We need to search the barn more thoroughly," Grace replied. "If Mom saw Reynolds there that night, if you caught him doing something, there might still be evidence. Something we've missed. Underscore, 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 underscore. The barn looked different in the moonlight shadows, transforming the familiar space into something mysterious, potentially threatening. Frank and Grace moved methodically through it, flashlight sweeping across every corner, every hidden space. "Mom's letter said you found something here," Grace said, examining the wall where Frank had discovered the PX 450 canister. "Something you weren't supposed to see." Suck. Frank tried again to access the missing memory to break through the chemical barrier that still blocked that night. Nothing came. "I've been in this barn thousands of times since then," he said. "Whatever it was, it's probably long gone." Grace knelt by the back wall, where the foundation met the dirt floor. Maybe not. If Reynolds was planting chemicals contaminating your soil to create false positives, he might have needed somewhere to store them. Temporarily. She ran her fingers along the edge of the wall. A hidden space. A cache. Frank joined her, tapping the wooden boards, listening for hollow sounds. Near the corner, one section sounded different. He pried at the board with a crowbar, and it came away easily, revealing a small cavity in the wall. Inside was a leather bag, dusty and cracked with age. Frank pulled it out carefully, setting it on the workbench. "It looks like a doctor's bag," Grace observed. Frank opened it slowly. Inside were several small glass vials, most broken now, their contents long since dried to crystals. There were also syringes, rubber gloves, and a notebook with Blackwood Chemicals logo on the cover. "This isn't mine," Frank said. "I've never seen it before." Grace put on a pair of work gloves and carefully opened the notebook. The pages contained chemical formulas, coordinates of local farms, and test results, all in cramped, precise handwriting. "This is it," she breathed. "This is what Mom found. Reynolds was documenting his contamination program." She flipped through more pages. He was injecting chemicals directly into soil samples, creating false positives that would justify Blackwood selling treatment chemicals to local farms. Frank leaned closer, looking at a map that had coordinates marked around his property, including spots near the water trough and in the barn. "He was poisoning our land," Frank said, anger rising in his voice, "and Ellie caught him." "No." Grace nodded. "This notebook is evidence of corporate fraud, environmental crimes, and motive for—" She couldn't finish. "For murder," Frank said flatly. Ellie was going to expose him, and he couldn't let that happen. Grace carefully closed the notebook and placed it in a plastic bag she'd brought from the house. "This is enough to take to the authorities, to force an investigation into Reynolds and Blackwood Chemicals." Frank stared at the bag, his mind racing. "Not yet. I want to confront him first. I want to see his face when he realizes his crimes have finally caught up to him." "Dad, that's dangerous," Grace protested. "We should let the police handle this. 23 years, Grace. 23 years I've lived under suspicion, under whispers, under my own guilt and doubt." Frank's voice was steel. "I need to look him in the eye. I need to ask him what he did to your mother." Grace recognized the same stubborn determination she'd inherited. "Fine. But we do it my way. Controlled, documented. Safe. And if he gives us anything, any reaction that confirms our suspicions, we go straight to the authorities." Frank nodded. "Tomorrow, then. At this conference." As they walked back to the house, the wind picked up, whispering through the trees that bordered the property. Maverick nickered softly from the pasture, a sound that seemed almost like a warning. Frank looked back at the barn, at the water trough that had started everything. The truth had been buried here all along, waiting patiently to be discovered. Now, after 23 years, it was finally coming to light. And somewhere, Frank thought Ellie was watching, guiding them toward the answers she'd died trying to reveal. That night, as Grace slept in her childhood bedroom, Frank sat at the kitchen table with the turquoise necklace in his palm. The crack in the stone seemed to catch the moonlight, glinting like a tear. "I'm sorry I didn't listen," he whispered to the empty room. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you. But I promise Ellie I'll make this right." He thought of Daniel Reynolds living his prosperous life, climbing corporate ladders, attending conferences, all while Ellie lay somewhere unknown, denied even the dignity of a proper burial. The rage he'd held at bay for so many years threatened to overwhelm him. But there was something else now, too. Hope. Hope for answers, for justice, for some kind of closure that might finally allow him to move forward. Frank carefully placed the necklace back in the metal box and closed the lid. Tomorrow would bring a confrontation 23 years in the making. He needed to be ready, needed to be strong. For Ellie, for Grace, for himself. Outside, the Oklahoma wind continued its soft, constant whisper across the land, carrying secrets that had been buried too long. The Whisper by the Trough. Part 3, Light from Darkness. The Oklahoma City skyline appeared on the horizon as Frank guided his truck down the interstate. Grace beside him, checking her phone for conference details. They'd risen before dawn, packing the leather bag, notebook, and other evidence in a secure case. Neither had slept well, the weight of their mission hanging heavy in the air. "The keynote address starts at 10, Grace said, scrolling through the conference schedule. "Reynolds is speaking on Sustainable Chemical Solutions for Modern Agriculture. Talk about irony." Frank's hands tightened on the steering wheel. 23 years of questions of guilt, of whispered accusations, all leading to this moment. The face of Daniel Reynolds, corporate executive and possible murderer, loomed in his mind. "What's our approach?" he asked. Grace tucked her phone away. "We attend as regular participants. The conference is open to agricultural professionals. I've registered us under my firm's credentials. We observe Reynolds during his speech, gauge his demeanor, then approach him during the networking session afterward. And if he recognizes me, he might not," Grace reasoned. "It's been over 2 decades, and you weren't exactly memorable to him. Just another farmer, whose land he was contaminating." She paused. "If he does recognize you, his reaction might tell us something important." Frank nodded, focusing on the road ahead. The city grew larger buildings, stretching toward the cloudless sky. They were getting closer to answers to the truth that had been buried for far too long. "What about Sheriff Cooper?" Frank asked. "Shouldn't we let him know what we're doing?" Grace considered this. "Let me call him. Give him a heads up without revealing everything. If something goes wrong, we'll need backup we can trust." She dialed, and Frank listened as she carefully explained to the sheriff that they were following a lead regarding Ellie's disappearance without mentioning Reynolds or their destination. "He says to be careful," Grace reported after hanging up. "He'll keep his phone close if we need him." Frank took the exit toward downtown Oklahoma City, navigating through increasingly congested streets until they reached the hotel hosting the conference. The parking lot was filled with expensive cars sporting corporate logos, a far cry from the muddy pickup trucks and farm vehicles Frank was accustomed to. "Ready?" Grace asked as they parked. Frank looked at his daughter, seeing Ellie's determination in her eyes. "As I'll ever be. Underscore, 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 underscore. The conference center buzzed with activity. Men and women in business attire, networking, examining product displays, exchanging cards. Frank felt conspicuous in his clean but simple clothes, but Grace moved with confidence, her professional demeanor making her blend seamlessly with the corporate crowd. They found seats near the back of the main hall, where a stage was set up for the keynote address. A large screen displayed the Blackwood Chemicals logo, a stylized tree with chemical symbols for leaves. "That's him," Grace whispered, nodding toward a group near the stage. Daniel Reynolds stood tall among his colleagues, silver-haired and commanding in an expensive charcoal suit. At 69, he carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to power and deference. His smile as he greeted important guests never quite reached his cold eyes. Frank's heart pounded. This was the man from Ellie's photographs, older now, but unmistakable. The man who had walked their land with a clipboard and false assurances. The man who might have been the last person to see Ellie alive. The program began, and Reynolds took the stage to polite applause. His voice was smooth practiced as he spoke about Blackwood's commitment to environmental stewardship and sustainable practices. The irony would be amusing if it weren't so tragic, Grace murmured, taking notes as Reynolds detailed Blackwood's newest, eco-friendly chemical treatments, solutions to problems his company had likely created. Frank barely heard the words. He was studying Reynolds' face, his gestures searching for some sign of the monster beneath the corporate veneer. Was this the face Ellie had seen in her final moments? Had these hands been responsible for her disappearance? When the speech ended and the audience applauded, Frank remained still, his eyes never leaving Reynolds as the man descended from the stage to accept congratulations from colleagues and industry partners. "Now's our chance," Grace said, standing. "Let's approach him during the mingling session." "Stay calm. Let me lead the conversation." They moved through the crowd toward the refreshment area, where Reynolds was surrounded by admirers. Grace smoothly inserted herself into the circle, offering a professional smile as she extended her hand. "Mr. Reynolds, excellent presentation. Grace Wilson, Environmental Law Specialist. I'd love to discuss your sustainability initiatives." Reynolds shook her hand with practiced charm. "Always pleased to meet members of the legal community interested in our work. Wilson, you say, are you with Henderson and Partners in Tulsa?" "Independent practice," Grace replied smoothly. "I specialize in groundwater contamination cases. Actually, my father has some experience with your early work." She gestured to Frank, who stepped forward. "Frank Wilson from Harper County." Reynolds' smile remained fixed, but something flickered in his eyes. A momentary hesitation, a flash of recognition quickly suppressed. "Harper County," he repeated. "That takes me back. I was a county soil inspector there before joining Blackwood." His gaze sharpened. "Wilson. I don't recall the name." "We had a farm near Millwood Creek." Frank said, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "You tested our soil back in '98, right before my wife disappeared." The change was subtle but unmistakable. Reynolds' posture stiffened, his smile becoming rigid. "I tested many farms in those days. Can't say I remember specific cases." He glanced at his watch. "If you'll excuse me, I have another appointment." Eleanor Wilson Frank continued blocking Reynolds' path slightly. She was concerned about chemical contamination in our water. She took photographs of unusual activity on our property. She was planning to go to the sheriff. He paused. "The day she vanished." Reynolds' eyes hardened, though his smile never wavered. "Mr. Wilson, I'm sorry about your wife, but I fail to see what this has to do with me or today's conference." Grace stepped closer. "We found your bag, Mr. Reynolds, in our barn, with the notebook documenting your soil contamination program for Blackwood." This time, Reynolds couldn't hide his reaction. The color drained from his face, and his right hand twitched slightly at his side. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, voice lower, "and I'd advise you both to be very careful about making accusations without proof." Frank met his gaze steadily. "We have proof. We have the PX 450 canister you used to drug me. We have your notebook with the contamination coordinates. We have Ellie's photographs of you on our property after hours." Reynolds glanced around, noting that other conference attendees were beginning to watch the exchange with curiosity. His jaw tightened. "This is neither the time nor place for this discussion," he said tersely. "If you have concerns, have your lawyer contact Blackwood's legal department." He turned to leave. "What did you do to my wife?" Frank asked, his voice carrying just enough for nearby people to hear. Reynolds stopped, turned back, slowly, eyes cold as winter. "Security," he called to a nearby guard. "These people are harassing me." He leaned closer to Frank. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, old man. Go back to your failing farm before you lose what little you have left." As security approached, Grace took Frank's arm. "We should go, Dad. We've made our point." Frank allowed himself to be led away, but not before calling over his shoulder, "This isn't over, Reynolds. Not by a long shot." Outside in the parking lot, Grace let out a breath she'd been holding. "Did you see his face when I mentioned the notebook? That was recognition, Dad. Guilt." Frank nodded, adrenaline still coursing through him. "He knows we have evidence. He'll be worried." "And potentially dangerous," Grace added. "We should go directly to Sheriff Cooper now." "We've confirmed Reynolds recognizes the significance of what we've found." Frank looked back at the hotel. He'll destroy any evidence he still has. Cover his tracks even more thoroughly. "All the more reason to get the authorities involved immediately," Grace insisted. As they reached the truck, Frank's phone rang. An unfamiliar number. He answered cautiously. "Mr. Wilson," came a smooth voice. "This is Martin Graves, head of security for Mr. Reynolds. He'd like to speak with you privately about your concerns. Perhaps we can reach an understanding." Frank met Grace's worried eyes as he replied, "What kind of understanding?" "The mutually beneficial kind. Mr. Reynolds is prepared to discuss compensation for any environmental impact to your property. Substantial compensation." "He's trying to buy us off," Frank mouthed to Grace, who shook her head vigorously. "I'm not interested in money," Frank said into the phone. "I want to know what happened to my wife." A pause. "Mr. Reynolds suggests meeting at the Riverside Park in 1 hour. Come alone. Just a conversation between old acquaintances. He believes he may have information about your wife's disappearance that would interest you." The line went dead before Frank could respond. "It's a trap," Grace said immediately. "He's panicking, trying to contain the situation." Frank stared at the phone. "Or he's willing to talk away from witnesses. This might be our only chance to get him to confess." "Dad, no, it's too dangerous. We need to call Sheriff Cooper. And say what that Reynolds offered to meet me, that he had a strange look on his face. We still don't have enough for an arrest, Grace." Frank started the truck. "But if I can get him talking, get him to admit what he did to Ellie." "Then I'm coming with you," Grace insisted. Frank shook his head. He said alone. "If he sees you, he won't talk." He saw the fear in his daughter's eyes and softened his tone. "Call Cooper. Tell him where I'm going, what we've found. Have him standing by." Grace struggled with this professional caution, warring with the knowledge that her father wouldn't be dissuaded. "Promise me you'll just talk. Don't confront him physically no matter what he says." "I promise," Frank said. "I just want the truth, Grace. That's all I've ever wanted. Underscore, 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 underscore. Riverside Park stretched along the bank of the Oklahoma River, a strip of green cutting through the urban landscape. Frank parked near the entrance and walked toward the river path, scanning for Reynolds or his security team. He found Reynolds alone on a bench overlooking the water, still in his conference suit, but with his tie loosened. The corporate executive looked strangely vulnerable in the open setting, away from his entourage and the trappings of power. "Wilson," Reynolds acknowledged as Frank approached. "I appreciate you coming. Please sit." He gestured to the space beside him. Frank remained standing. "You said you have information about my wife." Reynolds sighed. "First, let me be clear. I'm prepared to offer substantial financial compensation for any historical environmental impact to your property. 7 figures. No questions asked. Full confidentiality agreement." "I didn't come for money," Frank said coldly. "Everyone has their price," Reynolds replied, a hint of his corporate arrogance returning. "Think about what that kind of settlement could mean for you, for your daughter's career." "My price is the truth," Frank said. What happened to Eleanor Reynolds studied Frank for a long moment, calculation visible behind his eyes. Then something shifted in his expression, a weariness, perhaps even a touch of relief. "I never intended for anyone to get hurt," he said, finally looking out at the river. "It was supposed to be simple. Test the soil, create some contamination hotspots, sell the treatment. Standard practice for Blackwood in those days." He paused, "But your wife was observant." Frank's heart pounded. Was this it? After 23 years, was he finally going to hear what happened? "She noticed the patterns," Reynolds continued. "How farms that used our services paradoxically needed more treatments, not fewer. How the contamination always seemed to worsen after my visits." He shook his head. "She started following me, taking photographs. I found footprints near my testing sites, evidence someone had been examining my equipment." "She was protecting her land," Frank said. "Our land." Reynolds nodded slightly. "I reported the situation to my supervisor at Blackwood. They sent someone to manage the problem, a man named Carter. He handled special projects for the company." Carter. Frank repeated the unfamiliar name, landing like a stone in his chest. "I didn't know exactly what he planned," Reynolds insisted, a hint of desperation entering his voice. "The PX 450 was his idea. Make you confused, unable to corroborate your wife's claims if she went to the authorities." Frank stepped closer, anger building. What happened that night? What did I see in the barn? Reynolds looked up, surprise crossing his features. "You really don't remember, do you? The chemical worked better than expected." He sighed. "You caught Carter and me replacing soil samples in your barn. We'd been using it as a staging area because of its central location on the property. You became agitated, threatened to call the sheriff. Carter hit you from behind, not hard enough to cause serious injury, but enough to disorient you. Then he administered the PX 450, a mild dose, just enough to create confusion and memory loss." Frank's fists clenched at his sides. "And Ellie, what did you do to her?" Reynolds's face paled. "We didn't know she'd come looking for you. She must have seen the barn light on, investigated. She found you unconscious and us with the chemicals. She ran." His voice dropped. "Carter went after her." The world seemed to tilt under Frank's feet. "You killed her." "Not me," Reynolds said quickly. "Carter. I stayed with you, administered more PX 450 to ensure you wouldn't remember. When Carter returned, he said he'd taken care of the problem. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to know." "Where is she?" Frank demanded, voice breaking. "Where did he put her?" Reynolds looked genuinely regretful. "I don't know. Carter handled that part alone. He had experience with such matters." "This Carter," Frank said, struggling to control his rage. "Where is he now?" "Dead," Reynolds replied. "Car accident in 2004. Convenient for the company. He knew too much." Frank stared at Reynolds, this man who had helped destroy his family, who had covered up Ellie's murder, who had built a successful career on the foundation of that night's events. "I want you to confess," Frank said, "to the police, about the contamination program, about the PX 450, about Carter, about what happened to Ellie." Reynolds laughed bitterly. "That's not going to happen, Mr. Wilson. Statute of limitations has expired on most of those corporate violations. As for your wife, without a body, without Carter to testify, it would be your word against mine. A grieving, possibly unstable farmer versus a respected business leader." "We have your notebook," Frank reminded him. "Your chemicals, Ellie's photographs." "Circumstantial at best," Reynolds dismissed, "and easily explained away as standard testing procedures misinterpreted by an amateur." He stood straightening his jacket. "Take the money, Mr. Wilson. It's the best resolution you're going to get." Something in Frank snapped. 23 years of guilt, of suspicion, of loss, crystallized into pure rage. He grabbed Reynolds by the lapels, shoving him back against the bench. "My wife is dead because of you," he growled. "My daughter grew up without her mother, and you think you can buy your way out?" "Dad, stop," Grace's voice cut through his anger. She was running toward them, Sheriff Cooper close behind her. Frank released Reynolds, stepping back, chest heaving. Reynolds adjusted his jacket with shaking hands, his composed facade cracking. "This man assaulted me," he told the approaching sheriff. "I want him arrested." Sheriff Cooper, a steady man in his 60s with a weathered face and cautious eyes, assessed the situation calmly. "Mr. Reynolds, we'd like you to come to the station to answer some questions about the disappearance of Eleanor Wilson." "On what grounds?" Reynolds demanded, confidence returning. Grace stepped forward. "New evidence has come to light connecting you to the case." She nodded to Cooper, who produced a search warrant. "This authorizes us to examine records at Blackwood Chemicals relating to operations in Harper County between 1995 and 2000, as well as any personnel files for an employee named Carter." Reynolds paled. "You can't do this. Our corporate attorneys have been notified." Cooper interrupted. "This is a murder investigation now, Mr. Reynolds. Corporate privilege doesn't extend that far." As Cooper led a protesting Reynolds toward his patrol car, Grace turned to Frank. "I called Cooper immediately after you left. Showed him the notebook, the PX 450 canister, everything. He got an emergency warrant from a judge he trusts." Frank looked at his daughter, gratitude and love overwhelming him. "You saved me from making a terrible mistake." Grace hugged him tightly. "We're going to get justice, Dad. For Mom. The right way." Over her shoulder, Frank watched Reynolds being placed in the patrol car, the man's carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. It wasn't over, not by a long shot. But for the first time in 23 years, the path to truth lay open before them. Underscore, 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 underscore. The county courthouse was filled to capacity 3 weeks later, when Reynolds entered a plea agreement. In exchange for his testimony about Blackwood Chemicals' environmental crimes, he provided a full account of the events surrounding Eleanor Wilson's disappearance. Frank and Grace sat in the front row, listening as Reynolds described that night in clinical detail. The contamination program, Frank discovering them in the barn, the administration of PX 450 Ellie's arrival, and Carter's pursuit. "And where did Carter take Mrs. Wilson's body?" the prosecutor asked. Reynolds's voice was flat, emotionless. "To an abandoned well on Blackwood property, about 40 miles from the Wilson farm. It was later sealed and built over when the company expanded operations in 2005. Frank closed his eyes, the final piece of the puzzle falling into place. All these years, Ellie had been buried under the very company that had caused her death. The judge accepted Reynolds's plea, sentencing him to 15 years for conspiracy and accessory to murder, the maximum possible given the evidence and his cooperation. It wasn't justice, not truly, but it was something. Acknowledgement, truth. Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for statements. Grace handled them professionally, explaining how the case might impact other environmental whistleblower protections. Frank stood silently beside her, weathering the attention with the same quiet strength that had carried him through 23 years of uncertainty. When they finally escaped the media and returned to Frank's truck, Grace asked, "What now, Dad?" Frank stared through the windshield at the horizon. "We bring her home." underscore 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 underscore. The excavation of the old well site took 3 days. Frank watched from a distance as workers carefully removed layers of concrete and soil, digging deeper into the earth that had held Ellie's secret for so long. Grace stood beside him, her professional composure occasionally breaking as the reality of what they were witnessing hit her. This was not just a legal victory or an environmental case. This was her mother being returned to them at last. On the 3rd day, the forensic team called them over. They had found human remains along with a silver necklace with a cracked turquoise stone. Frank knelt beside the recovery site, tears flowing freely now. He reached out, not touching, but acknowledging finally the truth he had sought for so long. "We found you, Ellie," he whispered. "We brought you home." Underscore 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 underscore. 1 month later, Frank stood before a simple headstone in a small cemetery near their farm. Eleanor Wilson's name was etched in granite, along with her dates, and the words, "Beloved wife, mother, and protector." The funeral had been small, but meaningful, attended by those who had known Ellie, and some who hadn't. Farmers whose land had been saved by the subsequent investigation into Blackwood Chemicals' environmental activists, inspired by her story. Local people who had whispered about Frank for years, and now came to offer belated apologies. Walter Hayes had come too frail and apologetic, finally unburdened of the secret he had carried for too long. Grace approached, placing fresh wildflowers beside the stone. "The federal investigation into Blackwood is expanding," she said softly. 3 more executives have been indicted. They've identified similar operations in 5 other states. Frank nodded. "She would be proud of you." Carrying on her fight. "And proud of you," Grace added, taking his hand, "for never giving up." Together they stood in silence, father and daughter reunited in purpose as much as in grief. The truth had been painful, but it had also been healing, washing away years of suspicion and doubt. "I'm thinking of coming back more often," Grace said after a while. "Maybe opening a satellite office in Oklahoma City. Focus on environmental cases in rural communities." Frank looked at her surprise and hope mingling in his weathered face. "You'd do that?" She nodded. "Mom protected our land when no one would listen. There are other farms, other families facing the same battles. They need someone who understands." As they walked back toward the truck, Frank looked across his property. Maverick grazed peacefully near the fence, no longer afraid of the water trough or the barn. The land seemed different somehow, lighter, as if it too had been unburdened of a long-carried weight. That evening, Frank hung Ellie's photograph in the living room, not the fearful one from the evidence, but a happy one from before, showing her smiling in the sunlight holding a bunch of wildflowers. He stood looking at it for a long time, seeing not just what he had lost, but what he had found again. Truth, purpose, his daughter, and finally to peace. Outside, the Oklahoma wind swept gently through the trees, no longer carrying whispers of secrets, but the softer sound of resolution, of a mystery solved, a family healing, a wrong finally made right. Frank stepped onto the porch, looking out at his land as the sun set. For the first time in 23 years, the silence didn't feel like a burden. Now it was just silence, and that finally was enough.